Welcome to Live from the Library, presented by the Walnut Creek Library Foundation. I'm Peter Magnani, a member of the board of the foundation. The Walnut Creek Library Foundation, if you don't know us already, enriches the experience of both this library and our other Walnut Creek Library out on Oak Grove Road by funding programs and activities like the one we have here tonight, and also a lot of programs and activities, not just for adults, but for children and teens. In fact, I think it's fair to say that if you use these libraries for anything other than checking out a book, the foundation has probably touched your lives, because those programs happen because of what we're able to do. And we're able to do that because of your generosity. It's donors like you and sponsors that actually pay for these programs that are presented free at our public library. So if you're one of those people, I want to thank you for doing that. And if you're not, I want to tell you that our fund drive, our annual fund drive, will be starting up pretty soon. So if you get a solicitation from us in the mail, please consider becoming a funder. It's a lot of good stuff. You can also sign up to be on our e-newsletter outside after the program, in which case you'll get emails about all of the activities and programs here at the libraries. So please join us. So tonight we're pleased to present Bay Area author and photographer Leah Steinberg. Her book, Raised in the Shadow of the Bomb, Children of the Manhattan Project, documents the life experiences that she and others had trying to cope with the fact that their relatives, in Leah's case, her father and her uncle, were tapped to for the Manhattan project and helped to build the bombs that destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki and ushered in this whole new world that all of us have been trying to cope with ever since. Her book is filled with insights and thoughts about a lot of important subjects, and I think leaves you with the realization that aside from her personal experiences, we are all children of the Manhattan Project. So I want to introduce her now and suggest that after her talk, she's going to read from her book, and then she'll be out in the hall signing copies of the book if you want to do that. So look for that. And meanwhile, please join me in welcoming Leah Steinberg. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Is this loud enough? Okay. This is the most people I've ever had at a reading, so it's a little intimidating. So I want to thank Susan Moon and the Walnut Creek Library Foundation for inviting me to speak here tonight, and thank you all for coming. It's been about 2 years since I've published my book, and I've been thinking lately about how the times are different from when I grew up and the times now. And I'm sure many of you grew up in the same times when there was the duck and cover drills and the threat of constantly, is Russia going to drop the bomb? Are we going to drop the bomb? Are we going to end up like the end of Dr. Strangelove and bombs going off all over the world? And I'm sure that, like you, we still carry the fear of that around with us somewhere inside of us. And today there's just many more countries that have the bomb. It's not just us in Russia. So they're still out there, Turkey. And I've also been reading lately that the children today are having PTSD and anxiety about these shooter drills that are in schools all the time. And so in a way, there's a similar thing happening in another realm. And they're continually reminded that at any time someone could come into their school or to a garlic festival or a movie theater and shoot them up. And I think that's even more imminent now than the A-bomb being dropped on my suburban Chicago town that I grew up in. But what's the same, it seems to me, is that what's passed down from generation to generation is the underlying fear of not knowing, and not knowing what's going to happen and when and by who. And it's kind of the same legacy, I think, in a different way, that, how can we ever have a world of peace and evolution when all this is kind of always there? And I don't have any answers, but I think my book sheds a little bit of light on how youthful intellectual curiosity and creativity can be diverted into something unintended, and how that unintended result can become global. Which leads me to the intellect of some of the most brilliant scientists of the 1930s and 40s, and how their excitement and youthful inquiry led them to their careers of exploring the secrets of the universe and the world around us, and how that got diverted during World War II to wanting to stop the threat of Hitler, and how that legacy led to a shadow on mine and all of our lives. I'm sure that most of you know the Manhattan Project was the secret research and development of the first atomic weapon, and the site stretched all across the country from Oak Ridge, Tennessee, Chicago, Illinois, Los Alamos, New Mexico, Berkeley, California, Hanford, Washington, and lots of little sites in between. And it was all a secret, and that could have never happened today. I'm just going to start. I was a poet before and after this book, so I'm going to start with a haiku I wrote. A broken atom, hotter than 1,000 suns, into the Cold War. When I was 5, we lived in Copenhagen. My father had a Guggenheim Fellowship to work at the Niels Bohr Institute. And one of my favorite places was the Little Mermaid and Tivoli Gardens. And I'm going to read a little bit from the first chapter called In the Shadows. When I was 5 years old, I carried my small blue book bag to kindergarten in Copenhagen, learning to speak Danish, but knowing nothing of atoms or fission. What I remember most is cold winds blowing from the North Sea and a bronze statue called the Little Mermaid that came from the mind of Hans Christian Andersen. I gazed out to sea with her while my father spent a year working and studying at the Niels Bohr Institute. My father helped create the first atomic bomb, using mathematical and scientific principles to penetrate the unseen heart of matter. Brilliant scientists trusted they could split apart the smallest particle then known in the universe and create something new. The innate human passion for knowledge, intellectual exchange, and understanding the mysteries of the universe was especially strong at that time, due to new and exciting advances in chemistry and physics. That knowledge came to be utilized for military and political purposes, and subsequently was unleashed on the world. The conflict between pure science and the creation of increasingly destructive weapons arose from the work of Enrico Fermi, Leo Szilard, and Robert Oppenheimer, and the part my father played in that research affected him and me greatly. In 1943, my father was a graduate student in chemistry at the University of Chicago. He wrote about his recruitment to the Manhattan Project in the Journal of Chemical Education, and I'm going to read what he wrote. Quote, I arrived at New Chem on an interview visit and saw a number of my former classmates and graduate assistants from the University of Chicago walking past the guard through the entrance. One of them, William Buck Ribbenson, came out of a brief interview and then escorted me in to meet Charles Coriel in his narrow office. In his typical rapid-fire style, Coryell gave the whole story of fission, radioactivity, chain reaction piles, the scope of the project, and the race to get, quote, the bomb, unquote, before the Germans did. All this in less than about 20 minutes. During this tutorial outburst, his shirt tail was slapping out behind him, and he alternated between a perch on an overturned wastebasket and the blackboard to illustrate each point. Needless to say, I was overwhelmed, but so caught up in his obvious deep commitment to the job and his fervor that all I wanted to do was grab a pipette, a test tube, and a solution of bombarded uranium and get to work, unquote. In the next 20 minutes, my father's eyes were open and his mind expanded into the realms of nuclear chemistry and the inner world of the atom. He knew the theories, but Coryell explained to him how they might be made real and put to use on a large scale. Uranium fission, the splitting of the atom, was the immediate scientific goal, stopping Hitler, the political aim of the United States and its allies. My father's career took shape in less than half an hour, after he walked through Coryell's office and a door that didn't officially exist and into the future. The principles of the unseen that he heard described in those few minutes would in a few years collide with the political realities of the world, casting a global shadow over his and all our futures. If anybody wants to say anything in between, I'm just going to sort of read different parts from the book. That's fine. So I met my cousin for an anti-nuclear march in 1982, which was in New York City. And that kind of became the spark and the seed for the idea for this book, which took a very long time to have it materialize. So I'm going to read from Chapter 2, A Cartoon and a March. After the march and rally, Daniel and I continued our journey through his adopted city to his walk-up brownstone on the Lower East Side. Climbing the narrow, winding, seemingly never-ending stairwell, we arrived at the 5th floor. Immediately to the right in this tiny apartment was a kitchen barely large enough to turn around in. Ahead was his living room, and when I sat on the dark blue, second-hand, two-seated couch, it seemed like I might sink all the way down the 5 floors to the busy New York streets. In Daniel's bedroom, under a window that looked out over the city, stood a drawing table slanted at a 35-degree angle. In this corner of New York, he created his art. His political cartoons would make their way into the New Yorker, Rolling Stone, and dozens of other publications. On the floor was a small, worn rug. Without thought or discussion, Daniel picked up his sketch pad and pens, drew a picture of a fetus inside an atom bomb, and wrote "Children of the Manhattan Project" beneath it. He handed the picture to me and said, "We could have had our own contingent at the march." He ripped it off the drawing pad with the finality and sweep of his hand that said, "This is done, time to move on." And he did, because many years later, when I asked him about it, he said he did not remember drawing it. I, however, did not move on. Daniel's illustration stirred in me a familiar dread of non-vocalized disconnectedness. It now stared at me through a cartoon out of my cousin's pen, an umbilical cord made of split atoms. And I don't know if you can see this, but this is the cartoon that he made. And that was that kind of stayed with me for a decade or more, and I carried that cartoon around with me and wondered what to do with it. And finally, eventually, when the internet came around, I decided that maybe I could reach out and find other people who had parents who worked on the project too, and talk to them and find out what they thought. In 2004, I went to the 60th anniversary of the Manhattan Project in Oak Ridge, Tennessee. And I met a number of people there, one which was Dana Mitchell, and his father was one of the assistant directors with Oppenheimer at Los Alamos. And he spent 2 years of his youth living in Los Alamos, growing up and going to school. And we stayed in touch, and a couple years later, I asked him if he would like to meet in New Mexico and go to the Alamogordo site where his father took him just weeks after the test. And I'm going to read a little bit about that. We lined up for a single-file drive through the base to the Trinity site, escorted in by an official military security attaché. We were on our way to the spot that defined my parents' generation, driving backwards in time to this desert site and its one and only historic event, a 19-kiloton explosion creating heat 10,000 times hotter than the sun, an unsettling legacy for my own and all future generations. The nuclear age hangs like an invisible shadow in our minds, in our politics, in our hearts, and as a spiritual tearing apart of the atom, which is really 99.99% empty space and the smallest unit of matter. We were now inside the White Sands military range. Dana almost vibrated with excitement at being back at the site, tempered with his years of personal exploration and reflection, and I could see the sadness in his eyes. The last time, this is Dana speaking, the last time I was at Trinity was when I was 12 years old, just after the first atomic test. I've been trying to place the time when my father wrangled passes for us to go to the test site. I was trying to remember from the temperature exactly when that was. I remember being on a long stretch of highway that we are on now, but it was when cars didn't have air conditioning, so we could really feel the heat. We arrived at a clapboard wood guardhouse, nothing fancy, outfitted with a small tower for the FM radio antenna, connecting together the guardhouse and radio equipment cars. There was a car maybe every few hours, and the guard seemed very bored, saying, "Hello, goodbye, safe trip," or something like that. He would radio ahead to the next guard station. So I asked him, "How long did it take you to drive to the site?" "Forever. It was a long, dull, slow ride through the desert." "What were your father's reasons for taking you to the site so soon after the test?" "Before we left, my father told me he wanted to understand why he was going to be spending a lot of time in Washington, D.C., meeting with different congressional representatives and senators, people in government lobbying for civilian control of atomic energy and atomic weapons. Indeed, for a while, they managed to have that civilian control." "Really? I'd never heard of that." "Eventually, the military got hold of it and convinced everyone that they were the ones to handle the whole thing, unfortunately." "Indeed. Was that the only reason that he wanted you to see the site, to know why he would be away? Before you said he wanted you to see what it was like, what were your words?" "My father wanted me to see the actual test site because he didn't think that words or pictures could describe it. He also wanted me to see the destruction, fortunately without Hiroshima bodies. The desert brush that we are looking at now was falling over sideways by the wind of the blast waves from the bomb, and then the tremendous heat, fireball, and the infrared radiation, which charred all the bushes and trees in place. As we approached this area, all the bushes leaned out in a radial direction from the ground zero point. They were charred in place, and they looked like something out of Transylvania. That was scary. That was really scary stuff." So it kind of blew my mind that his father had taken him there just a few weeks afterwards, and he was 12 years old. And it was like, well, didn't your father think it was kind of radioactive? And he was like, well, we didn't stay very long, and he trusted his father, so, it was, quite interesting.
Is he still with us, or does he have cancer?
He died about 3 years ago, unfortunately. It was heart disease. He was about 72. Yeah. So, I had kind of worried about that too, but it was really a tragic story of his father, because he ended up, his father ended up committing suicide. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Fairly.
To have friends in school whose father committed suicide.
Oh, I didn't know that. Yeah, it's sad. Very sad. A lot of people had trouble dealing with it.
Or the secrecy, we always thought in Livermore that the secrecy of their work attracted people who might be inclined to suicide.
To what?
Who might be inclined to suicide.
Mm.
So there was not a conclusive, the work caused it, but the secrecy at Livermore Lab did produce a lot of psychological pressures.
Mm. Yeah, I'm sure that's true. Yeah.
Went to Anahuac and all the test sites in Nevada, and he didn't die. He died at 93, but not of cancer.
Well, that's
so
great.
we had a lot of friends who went to these places, and they had precautions, extreme precautions. I mean, to the point where my father wouldn't let me have have my teeth x-rayed because of the radiation. Oh, sorry, I'm not used to this. And then there's also these places where you could look at a shoe store and look and see if the
Yes,
shoes
I remember
fit your
those,
feet.
yeah.
And that was more radiation than a lot of these things that they were extra
Yeah,
precautions.
one of the women that I talked to, her father was the same way. Wouldn't let her do the shoe thing, or was very cautious about dental x-rays and that sort of thing. Yeah. So yeah, there was a wide range. I mean, in talking to these different people, some people had, no problem with it. They were very proud. Other people had other leftover ideas and feelings, so it was really a wide range.
Yeah, well, and they also say if that hadn't happened,
Yeah.
a lot more Americans would have been killed in the war.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah. So,
that's-
yeah, and I
that's
don't
a-
think there's any, there's no way to go back and know and redo the history, but, I mean, people, as with anything, have wide-ranging opinions and feelings on the matter, which is pretty much what my conclusion on the book.
is that everybody has.
Yeah. Anybody? Okay. So let's see. Oh, and so another woman who I met at the Oak Ridge reunion, also her father was at the test. I mean, he didn't take her to the test to see it, but I'll read a little bit about what she said he told her about the test. If I can find it. All right. Okay, so this is her speaking, Julie Schletter. Speaking of primitive technology, one of the things my dad described in his memoirs was the day of the Trinity test. He was not planning to be at the test. He was writing reports and finishing things up when he got a frantic call from Oppenheimer, who told my dad that they needed a radio right away. My dad described the radio that they had at the site as putting out only 1 watt of power from batteries the size of a stable. They had extremely primitive transistors. So here they just built this atomic bomb, and they had a radio that had 1 watt of power and didn't really work. Well, So that's what my response was. Here they can make this atomic weapon, but they don't have working batteries. I can't believe. I know they've got this radio going. They only have to have something that works over 18 miles, and they can barely hear each other. What is going on here? So he saves the day and brings out a workable radio. So here he was at Trinity, standing next to the tower at Alamogordo, sunscreen on his face. Sunscreen? Yes, a bit inadequate. Oh, just a bit. He said on the 4 to 5 hour bus trip back to Los Alamos, several people had pulled out bottles of scotch. They sat on the bus in silence. They passed bottles around and no one spoke the whole way. I believe that is the night that my father knew that this would end the war early, but also that it was a horrible, horrible thing. It was around that time, I believe, that he decided to devote his life to the peaceful use of atomic energy. He conducted research, did politicking and schmoozing, and flew all over the world. He went to South America, the Soviet Union, anywhere he could to promote the work of the scientists who wanted to stop the future production of atomic weapons. His favorite thing to do, and my father could have done anything in the world, would have been to play with electronics. He would have created bigger and better computers. As a matter of fact, he created the first computer game, Tennis for Two, on October 15th, 1958, at Brookhaven Lab in New York. But that's not how he wanted to be remembered. So if Oppenheimer hadn't called him for the radio, he never would have seen the test, and the rest may have never happened. It was as if he was there so he could witness the explosion and know if he had to bring the world the opportunity to turn it around. He also helped start the Bulletin for Atomic Scientists, William Higginbotham, her father, and also was the person who, with somebody else who I can't remember his name, created the first doomsday clock in 1947. So I just have one other thing to read, and then we can have questions. Let's see. So this is kind of my conclusion. This book was a journey into a moment in history that still defines our world. All the people I talk with had strong opinions about the further development of nuclear weaponry, believing that the A-bomb should never again be used. All had a sense of pride in the importance and legacy of science. All were exposed and encouraged to participate in music, art, literature, and intellectual conversation and pursuits as children, and were committed to making the world a better place. The legacy of psychological and physical effects lingered for many. Most strikingly, how do you erase the emotional impact of seeing a scene of Armageddon as a child of 12 and a suicide of your parents as an adult? Some of the parents had a seemingly casualness toward their work and children. Barbara's dad allowed her to take Trinitite to school. My uncle contemplated bringing a vial of chemicals for his son to put on the chair of a boy who was bothering him. Only after some spilled when he was bottling it did my uncle decide it was too powerful to put in the hands of a child. As Christy's father bravely and with dedication to his work and country ran out to shut down the valves at a secret lab in a Berkeley Hill, he must have known he was sacrificing his health. In that moment, he not only saved the city and surrounding area from a radiation leak, but changed his daughter's future. And I'm just going to end with a poem that I wrote at the end of the book, and I knew I was done with the book because I could write a poem again. It's called Infinite. Deep in the desert sand, a hidden bunker is silent. On a cold cement floor, a small girl curls up next to a stagnant atomic creation. Never alive, never dead, wrapped in a repeating decade of a hallowed dream of limbo. The casing reflects nothing of its inner core, waiting to be either disassembled or released from its underground home. The girl wakes, walks unsteadily toward a bomb that points upward to a galaxy of infinite possibility. She circles like an Orthodox Jewish woman, slowly walking around the room 7 times. She wonders if there is a world where the dead do not walk next to her, realizes the irony, then dances in the crater where the universe was discovered in invisible tracings of a scattered promise. Thank you. So, any question? Yes? Oh,
Did your father ever go to the Atomic Bomb Museum in Japan?
I don't believe so, no. No. Oh, she asked if my father ever went to the Atomic Museum in Japan, and no, he didn't. Yes? Oh, yeah.
I'm curious how many people here had their relatives work on the Manhattan Project.
Oh, that's a good question.
Repeat the question.
Oh, the question was how many people here had who had relatives that worked on the Manhattan Project, and it looks like 3 or 4. Where did your father, or where did your relatives work?
My father was a physicist, and he was hired by the Met Lab in Chicago
Oh, that's where I thought, yeah.
in 1943. So
Oh.
he worked there through about October of 43, and then he was assigned to Oak Ridge.
Oh,
And they had a laboratory set up in Oak Ridge. So he worked with my mother and his newborn, my sister, born at the time. So they lived in Oak Ridge for about 7 months. And
well, they probably had met each other and knew each other in some way.
oh,
Yeah, both. He was at the Met Lab as well, my father.
they
Same
must
year,
have been,
yeah.
He was there. I mean, I don't know how many people were there. But
Yeah.
he, I think like others, he was hesitant ever to talk. My regret is that I never asked him much. I tried, but
Mm-hmm.
we didn't get much information out of him. So I mean, about his feelings about it, or even that he worked. He worked in the metallurgical laboratory.
That's where my father was, yes.
And he was dealing with the cyclotron
Mhm.
at Y12 producing uranium-235. So
Mm-hmm.
that was his job, was superintendent of the lab. But I'm still curious about the need to know and the secrecy of how much he really knew. I mean, did he know about Los Alamos?
I'm sure he did.
I got to think he did.
Yeah.
My
They, I'm pretty sure most or all the scientists that were working there, they knew what was going on.
Yeah, he had to. My mother
Yeah.
liked to say she knew nothing, and she did. She didn't know anything, but he never chimed in and said, "I don't know nothing either." So you have to assume that he did, but he didn't want to talk about it
Yeah.
much.
Well, thank you for sharing. Yes.
Did anyone that father nor get swept up in the Oppenheimer hearings and what happened with it? Was there any political stuff going on?
The question was there any political things?
Because of the Oppenheimer thing
Yeah.
afterwards and the whole controversy about all of that.
I think I did. I don't think that really, affected at least my father's work. After the project, he went to work at Argonne National Lab, and that's where he worked his entire career. And I'm sure that it probably affected the scientists a lot on a personal level, just knowing what was going on with him and how he was persecuted. But I don't think it really affected their work. Yeah.
How did your father feel about it afterwards?
He didn't really talk about it. Yeah. The only clue that I had was after my father passed away, and I don't know, it was sometime in the mid-90s, and the internet was just getting big, and I thought I would type his name into the computer just to see what, if anything, would come up. And there was this petition that was signed by 69 of the scientists at the Met Lab that was sent to Truman saying that now that the bomb, now that the war was over with Germany, they urged him not to use the bomb. And I know that because Oppenheimer was under such scrutiny, he blocked that petition from going to Los Alamos, from having more people sign it. But my father's name was on that petition, and that was, kind of my first clue of knowing how he felt about it afterwards.
And your mother as well?
My mother,
How did she feel?
she didn't really talk about it. She was just proud of my father's work.
So as a child growing up,
I'm sorry, if I can just interrupt. For the filming, we need the questions into the mic so that it will get good recording. Otherwise, people just hear the answer and not the question, and they don't know what the question is.
So I thought I'd just make a comment that sort of rounds out your book. I happened to be in India at the time that General Tibbets and his family were in India, and he was one of the 2 pilots who dropped. They didn't know which one of them was the one that actually carried the bomb. But what was striking to me was the fact that he said that neither he nor the other plane pilot knew which one, and what it was like for his son, who was my friend, to grow up around the notion that his father played a pivotal role in the ending of this war, and what it was like because General Tibbets would not obviously talk about it. He was not allowed to talk about it, but what it was like knowing over at his house that this was an event that he had participated in, and what it was like for him and his children to have this corner of history that you can't ever talk about. It was pretty powerful.
Yeah. Yes. And yeah, I think that there was, even on that petition, when I found it, it had a big secret on it that was, not declassified and let out until sometime in the late 80s or something. So yeah, having a profession where that was the root of it, kind of had, a psychological
As a
impact.
pilot, he was dropping bombs all the time.
Right.
And so
And what was his name?
Paul Tibbets.
Oh, Tibbets, yeah. He spoke actually at that reunion in Oak Ridge. Yes, he was there. I think he passed away soon after that, yeah.
Such a lovely family, but the notion that he was flying all the time, and as a part of being in the service, there's a mentality that goes with the pilots when they drop bombs, whether it's a bomb that is an atomic bomb or a bomb that's going to, when you're heading out, that your job is to go and kill people. You let that bomb go, you don't see them die, but you know that that's your mission. And so to have that as your life and to be rewarded because you are the figurehead, it's just an extraordinary experience that he had to keep to himself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I'm sure that there's a lot of people who
It really changes
have
the landscape, I think, of the marriage and your children, being a parent, because there's a whole part of your life you cannot,
yeah,
or lots
speak of.
you can't,
Yeah.
you can't speak of, and you don't want to speak of.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There was some of the people that I talked to, the scientists at Los Alamos, they weren't supposed to talk about, what happened when they went through the fence. But a lot of the women were pretty darn smart, and they figured it out. They knew they were scientists. They knew they were physicists. They figured, the war was going on. It was they figured that they were working on something like that. So, yeah, but a lot of the kids were, just kind of up there going to school, having their friends, like Dana, it was, yeah. Yes, sorry.
I just wanted to say that the atmosphere you're talking about of secrecy continued in Livermore. It was a small town around Livermore Lab, and Sandia had an extension from Los Alamos to Livermore the whole time, and still does in Livermore, although the town grew. But when I was a child, I mean, my father was a nuclear chemist in Berkeley, and he worked on the Manhattan Project as a research assistant, very young, possibly even a student while he was doing that, and getting his chemistry degree at Berkeley. And my mother said that he didn't believe it would work. Like, he didn't think that it could possibly work when he was working on it. But later, of course, his whole career was as a nuclear chemist at Livermore. And the secrecy that you're talking about, the psychological impacts of not knowing what your father did, and your mother, perhaps even, we had quite a few scientists on our street who were women who were working out at the lab as well. And that continues today. And in fact, you know, we had even teachers in our high school that didn't understand that she couldn't ask us as children to volunteer our father to come and talk about something in the physics class because we didn't know what he did. You know, I mean, the whole town was like that. So in terms of, you know, the secrecy and things like that, that was pervasive through the whole community for my entire childhood. So
Yeah.
I later worked in ag biotech, in ag chemicals. In my opinion, things are tools. So if there's a weapon that can end a war early, you know, I would be in favor of that. In terms of unleashing things, my personal opinion is, at the moment, we have a lot more chemical problems and environmental problems than the bomb. And I think the bomb probably has less chance of ending the Earth
Yeah, I agree.
than climate change.
Yeah,
you know,
I agree.
Unintended.
I agree. You know, I mean, it's, I think there's a lot more problems that are going to, you know, end the human race than a bomb going off. But
I get migraines from my neighbor's laundry chute.
what?
I get migraines from my neighbor's fragrance and VOCs and things from the laundry fumes coming into my yard. I
Okay.
can't get away from it. So I'm a little worried.
Does anybody else have any questions? Yeah.
I have two questions. First of all, how long was there a requirement of secrecy after the war? And second of all, have you seen any pattern in terms of the life course or careers and values of the children of the scientists?
Well, I don't know how long the secrecy was in effect. Do you, David? Oh.
Yeah, I mean, things like the critical mass, I'm not sure that that's even declassified now, but our dad's thesis wasn't released until well after the war. So it depends. There were, I mean, different things were declassified at different times.
Okay. And the other question was about well, one of the things I found was just the people that I talked to, no matter what they went into, like as a career later on, that eclecticism was very important. You know, like, you know, whether somebody be interested in literature and music and you know, medicine and law, you know, and so having a really broad concept of the world seemed to be extremely important, and not just being focused on one particular thing, just as a I think that was most of the people that were there. I mean, up in Los Alamos, they were a lot of musicians, and, you know, they were very interested, you know, in even, strangely enough, Edward Teller had a radio station up at Los Alamos. And so I think that most people went into careers that were going to further humanity in some way, whether it be medicine or literature or music or the children. Yeah.
On the subject of releasing information afterwards and keeping the secrecy, I did find a lot of correspondence my dad had kept, and among them was letters that would say, I think it came out in September or October, saying to all, you know, it was written to all members of whatever group he was with, saying, despite the cessation of hostilities with Japan, basically keep your mouth shut. It didn't give a time. I don't remember a time being on it, but it was, you know, it wasn't that, oh, the war's over now, it's free to talk about it.
Right.
So it was.
Well, there was somebody, actually, I just remembered, who I interviewed, who was actually his father was the youngest person on the project. He was at the University of Chicago when he was 16, and Fermi wanted him to go down to Los Alamos, so he went to his parents and said, I'll be his guardian. I can't tell you where I'm taking him. I can't tell you what he's going to do, but I'll take care of him. And his parents went, oh, okay, you know, and off he went to Los Alamos when he was 16. And I just remembered the story that his son said he couldn't even travel overseas until sometime in the late 70s. So supposedly they thought he knew too much, the man who knew too much, you know, and would not, you know, let him travel. So I think it sort of carried over in a lot of different areas, you know, the secrecy. But yeah, that was kind of a bizarre story. I actually met his father there. He was at the reunion. He was one of the last people to, you know, there wasn't too many scientists left at that point in 2004. But yeah, I know that was just like, yeah, okay, yeah, good, sure, take him. You know? Different times, yeah. Can you imagine somebody coming in, like your 16-year-old, and it's like, well, I'm going to take him off to somewhere, and I can't tell you why, and I can't tell you what he's going to do, but just trust me. And it's like, oh, okay. Yeah. I guess Fermi had a good way about him that his parents believed him for some reason.
How many children of the scientists were you able to connect with for the book?
I did about 16 interviews. Yeah. I tried to find more people, and you know, it was just kind of hard. But and there was more that I actually found, and some people didn't want to talk. So.
Growing up in Livermore with Livermore Lab, growing like crazy.
So, any other questions, comments? Anything you want to say to each other?
Yeah, I'm just wondering, you know, now that you're grown and you maybe have had time to reflect about how your father was and maybe your mother too, and how they affected you, and what has the effect been on you, if any, that you've learned about yourself?
Well, I think that by doing this book, I understood more of how somebody, you know, I guess when I was younger, it's like, how could you do that? How could you work on something like that? And it's like, I understand more the times and the influences, and why these scientists were so excited about working on this, and just how situations can bring you into something that, you know, part of it's good and you really want to do it, and part of it's like you look back and it's like, how did I get caught up in that? So I think, you know, I just understand humanity better, maybe. Just how things can happen, and understand and be more at peace with the whole situation.
Leah, thank you for helping us
Oh,
understand.
thank you.
And anybody, if you haven't read it yet, it'll be on sale out there, and it's a really great opportunity to get a lot more in depth on some of these great questions that we've had. So thank you again.
Thank you so
and,
much for having me. Thanks for all coming.
sell some books.